Over the weekend, we saw something rather unprecedented, the People's Action Party giving a post-mortem of sorts on its performance at GE 2020.
These reviews aren't usually made public, and it's just the latest in a series of surprises from this general election.
The PAP's 61.2% vote share was the third lowest to date. While it looks shocking at a glance, this figure is actually a throwback to the mid-1980s and 1990s when PAP got between 61 and 65% of the votes.
And according to National Development Minister Lawrence Wong, who gave a press conference on Saturday, the party is unlikely to get more than 65% of the popular vote in the future.
We are unlikely to exceed 65% of the vote in future. The desire for diversity in Parliament, for checks and balances is permanent. It is here to stay. And we must be prepared for this new reality. For now, Singaporeans want to see the PAP in power, but they also want a credible opposition to check on the PAP.
Senior Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam was the second PAP leader to give his take, writing on Facebook that the election outcome reflects a desire for a new balance in politics.
Mr. Tharman also said the results were good for PAP for a couple of reasons. First, it secured a solid mandate, and second, the 8.7-point swing is leading the party to review its own game.
News editor at the Straits Times, Zakir Hussain, is back to take this further. Zakir, there are several top-line figures to look out for when it comes to crunching down PAP's margin of victory. A 61.2% vote share with an 8.7-point swing, but PAP is still winning 83 seats in Parliament. So what is the one statistic that is most telling of PAP's performance at GE 2020?
I think it's tough to pin it down to one statistic. I think you have to look at both the 83 out of 93 seats, as well as the 61.23% share of the national vote. 83 of 93 is significant because it shows that the majority of Singaporeans still want a PAP government. And in many of the seats, these are won by comfortable victories. It's only 22 seats apart from Sengkang and Aljunied, only in 22 seats out of the 83 that the PAP got was the margin of victory lower than 60%. Now that's significant.
National Development Minister Lawrence Wong said 2 days ago that it's unlikely that PAP will exceed a 65% vote share in the future. Is it possible now, mathematically speaking, that PAP loses its two-thirds majority in Parliament if its vote share slides below 60%?
Conceivably, for these seats to cross over, you would need a much further swing away, and for all of these 22 seats to be won by the opposition. So yes, technically it is possible at the next election, if some of these issues are not resolved, that in the next election or the next two elections, we see the PAP's margin of victory, go slightly below the two-thirds majority it needs to amend the constitution.
Well, you asked a big question in your insight piece in yesterday's Sunday Times. Does GE 2020 mark a return to the norm of PAP's vote between the low to mid-60s, or is it even the start of a new normal where its vote share isn't a given? Can you answer that?
I think a lot of it will depend on what happens in the next 5 years. Minister Lawrence Wong, I think, mentioned that the PAP lost about 100,000 votes with the 61% vote share. Had these 100,000 voters nationally voted for the PAP, the vote share would have been closer to 64-65%. Now, what needs to happen, I think, is a cocktail of several factors. I think if some of the grievances of these people, if, say, COVID-19 is prolonged and the economic pain lingers for quite some time, you might see more than 100,000 voters actually swing away from the PAP because they feel that, they can't find proper work, the economic prospects are gloomy, and so on. There are also several other things that could happen in between now and then. I think one of the points that the PAP has mentioned will happen between now and 2025 is a hike in the GST by 2 percentage points. that could be something that causes unhappiness, even though the government said it will have a generous offset package. Other conditions, for instance, if say the resumption of travel takes 2 years or 3 years, the tourism sector, retail, services, these are sectors where a huge number of Singaporeans are employed in. And if our slump continues for 2 or 3 years, it's quite unlikely that this will be resolved by the 2025 election.
So let's talk about PAP's post-mortem press conference on Saturday. We're calling it a post-mortem, but in our chat before the show, you described it as a preview to a fuller review that PAP does after every GE, which is not even made public. So how come we saw a departure from the usual practice this time around?
I think a couple of things. I think there's a sense among PAP activists that, people are quite unsettled. Everyone seemed to be a bit grim and gloomy about the result when actually they did win 61% of the votes. And I think the post-mortem press conference was addressed as much as activists as it was at the general public. And it was to kind of reiterate to them that actually, look, the PAP's base did support it in the election. Your lower income voters, your huge middle class, the majority of workers. In fact, many of these people actually continued to back the PAP because they felt, they were benefiting from Singapore's economic growth and progress over the years. One issue I think that I think the PAP wanted to address as well through this review was, I think, to explain that it was not just young voters. I think we saw a lot of the commentary and speculation over the past week that young voters and the PAP's lack of ability to engage them well online may have costed the votes. I think that did play a factor, but I think they wanted to stress that it was also your middle-aged swing away from the PAP. After all, these make up a larger proportion of voters, workers in their 40s, 50s, and even early 60s who lost jobs due to COVID-19 or saw their incomes sharply reduced as a result of the circuit breaker. And I think it wanted to set the record straight as well on this. Now, the PAP's postmortems usually involve quite a lot of looking at the data for each constituency, looking at which segments of voters might have lost them, even interviewing activists about what went wrong during the campaign. And usually it's never made fully public, but what happens is at the end of the year, the party leaders will elaborate on it a little bit when the party meets for its annual conference or convention at the end of the year in November or early December. And I think likely that's probably when we'll get a fuller picture of what went wrong at the GE.
Thanks very much as always, Zakir. That was the Straits Times news editor, Zakir Hussain.